A lot of you have asked me if the training system to becoming a doctor is better in Switzerland or in the UK. I went to medical school in the UK and I'm now doing my specialty training in Switzerland. And the answer depends on lots of factors. So what I'm going to do in this video is go through 5 main points that I feel are very different in the UK and in Switzerland. And by looking at these points, depending on what type of person you are and what your priorities are, I think you'll be able to discern which one's better for you. I moved to Switzerland a couple of months ago and I was completely in the dark as to how the training system worked here. I was used to the UK where the pathways are pretty standardized, the application process is standardized, everything is pretty much clear. So typically if you want to become a surgeon, then you will still go through F1 and F2, so the foundation year, and then you have to submit an application with interviews and exams to get into the surgical training pathway, after which you can then specifically decide what type of surgeon you want to become. Similarly, if you want to become a nephrologist, you'll still go through foundation 1 and F2, and after that you'll go through an application process with an exam and an interview, after which you can start your core medical training. So the pathways are spelled out for you. That's not exactly the case in Switzerland. It's pretty much à la carte. You look at the prerequisites for each type of specialty that you're interested in, whether it be peds or nephrology. I don't know why I keep mentioning nephrology. And you look at the specific requirements for each of those. And it will depend on 2 things. So a number of years in each specialty and also the size of the hospital in which you're working in. So you have to have a minimum number of years in a certain type of hospital for it to count in your final specialty. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. So let's talk about the 5 main points that I think are very different between Switzerland and the UK training system. First point I would say is that in Switzerland, you start your specialty training straight from med school. Now, what I mean by this is, in the UK, everybody goes through foundation training year 1 and 2. No matter if you want to become a pediatrician, a surgeon, an emergency physician, you all go through the same 2 foundation years. And during those years, you rotate. So every 4 months, you go into a different department. Now, depending on a couple of exams that you'll pass in your final year of med school, you will rank the location that you want to be in and the jobs that you would like. So hopefully, if you know exactly what you want to do later, then you can try and pivot and use those jobs to your advantage so that you already get experience in your field of interest. However, a lot of people take advantage of F1 and 2 to try lots of different things, specialties that they're curious about or that they've not really had much exposure to, and it's a really good time to actually work in that specialty and figure out if it's something that you're interested in for the future. In Switzerland, as soon as you leave medical school, you go straight into your specialty of choice. So let's say you want to become a pediatrician, you will go through from your 6th year of medical school into your 1st year of pediatrics training, and you will finish in pretty much 5 years, roughly speaking, if everything goes well. So the disadvantage of that is you don't really have the time to explore all the specialties that you could potentially be interested in. If you start as soon as you leave med school, if you start pediatrics and then 2 years later you realize that actually you prefer treating adults, then you've kind of wasted 2 years that are not going to count for the different specialty that you want to try. So that's a bit of a shame, and I think as medical students there is no way that we can experience all different types of specialties during medical school. So it doesn't give you that leeway to explore and try different specialties. The advantage of that, on the other hand, is that you finish your training much quicker. So you avoid the general training that you get in foundation years 1 and 2 and go straight into the specialty of your choice, which means that in theory you can pretty much finish your pediatrics training in 5 years, as opposed to the UK where you'll still have to do your foundation years and, you know, do a couple of extra things that will take you much longer. So the Swiss system can definitely be an advantage for somebody who knows exactly what they want to do, as I'll come to later, has applied very early in advance so that they can get through those specific number of training years as quickly as possible. If, however, you're not sure about what you want to do or you'd like to try many different things, it may not be most suited to you. Point number 2 is opportunity and saturation. In the UK, when you're in your final year of medical school, you will do an exam and then start ranking the jobs that you'd like to do and the location in which you would like to do them. And this is your foundation years that we're talking about, so foundation year 1 and 2. Pretty much everyone will have a spot guaranteed somewhere in the country in some type of specialty. Everyone goes through the same system and you can't apply early in your 4th or 5th year to try and get an advantage. It's a standardized system. Pretty much ensures that almost no one gets left behind and everybody has some part of the pie somewhere in the country, even if it's not your first choice. It's a whole other story in Switzerland. First of all, it's a smaller country, so there is more competition and less opportunity. Second of all, it's made even smaller depending on the language that you speak. So if you only speak French, then you're limited to that part of the country and you can only apply there. And it's the same thing for the German-speaking side and the Italian side. On top of that, not every hospital is equal. So there are small district hospitals and then much larger university hospitals, and there's very few of those in Switzerland. So what does all that mean? Essentially, if you're a student in Switzerland, you have to be prepared. From having spoken to different doctors that are in training here, they pretty much told me that everyone here applies for jobs from their 4th year of medical school. So they've got 2 years left, but they're already applying so that as soon as they graduate, they have a job waiting for them. It is much more possible in Switzerland to be left with no job if you haven't prepared in advance, or to try and fill in a spot last minute on the other side of the country. So really there is no centralized system. Each canton has its own set of rules, and in each canton, each hospital has their specific set of rules, and they decide who they want to employ. There is no centralized, standardized system in Switzerland. So it's very common to find somebody who, say, wants to do pediatrics, but they've not been able to get a spot in peds yet because it's very competitive, and they end up in geriatrics or in adult medicine just waiting every year, reapplying to try and get one of those spots. I mean, the disadvantage is pretty clear. You may end up having to waste multiple years trying to get into the specialty that you're interested in, and finally maybe your training pathway will take even longer than a country like the UK, where yes, there are foundation years you need to go through, but at least there's a standardized program with a fixed number of years, generally speaking, unless you fail an exam or something. I suppose you could say it's an advantage for Swiss medical students or people who know how the system works, who apply way in advance, because typically if you do apply 2 years in advance, you can pretty much sort out your career pathway without too much trouble. So for those who know how the system works, it's an advantage, I guess. Point number 3, the application process. Now, this is very different to what you may be used to in the UK. In the UK, again, I keep saying this word, it's standardized. We all go through the same exam in medical school. We all rank our top choices of specialties and locations for foundation year programs. And then after that, there's a standard exam in which you are ranked. So depending on what you want to do, whether it be a medical job or a surgical job. And that's pretty much how it is throughout the whole training program. Of course, networking is important everywhere. You know, it does help to be appreciated by your team and to have, say, a consultant who's supporting you and who's giving you advice as to where to apply to and who knows that you're interested in a certain position, so that if ever there is that position available, they'll think of you first. So that happens in every country, and it happens in every realm of life, I think, not just medicine. But there is a spectrum, and Switzerland is on a different side of the spectrum to the UK with regards to the application process. You apply directly by sending your application, so with your CV, your cover letter, your recommendation letters, directly to the head of department in a particular hospital. And you just hope that you get a response, and hopefully you've applied early enough, so 1 or 2 years in advance, to be able to get a position. Now, this is generally the process. As you've seen in my last video, I didn't have to wait that long. I was really lucky and managed to find a position when someone was leaving their post. Because it's not a centralized, standardized system, it's really difficult for the HR team and the head of departments to distinguish between candidates. Usually they all have really good CVs and they've done really well in their careers, and they're all applying for the same position. And it's a small, saturated country. So how do they distinguish between those doctors and decide who to give that position to? Well, that's where the interviews come in, but they can't interview everyone. And that's when it's based on the quality of your CV and the application that you send in, and also who you know. So if you've worked with one of the consultants in a known hospital and you've done really well, they can personally recommend you to the consultant in the hospital you're applying to. And that is going to make all the difference. Like I said, this happens everywhere. There is literally no country in the world where networking and knowing the right people is not going to help you forward in your career. I guess you just feel it more in Switzerland because there is no standardized process, so you have to heavily rely on this networking and on making a good impression and, you know, asking your head of department to recommend you to the next head of department. So all that has more importance in Switzerland. The clear advantage for this is that it's not all just based on one exam. It's not that one metric. It's going to depend on the interview, so what type of person you are, how you come across. It's going to be based on your last jobs and your recommendation letters. So if you were appreciated in your last job, even if you didn't do the best in, you know, whatever exam, then they will likely consider you for the next position. So it takes the human factor more into account. And it's also great for people who are very out there and like networking. In Switzerland, it's something that can really be to your advantage. The disadvantage is if you're the other type of personality where actually networking takes a lot of energy to do and it's really something that you don't like to rely on too much, that can put you at some disadvantage. And also just being new to the country and new to the system, it takes time to figure these things out. This is me learning these things after months of talking to the other doctors in training, the ones that have been in Switzerland, who have trained in Switzerland, who've gone to uni in Switzerland, and just learning this bit by bit. And so you're definitely at a clear disadvantage if you come in from a different country not knowing any of this. And that's partly why I'm making these videos, so that hopefully if you are considering working as a doctor in Switzerland, you can take these things into account and be prepared so that they're not a disadvantage for you. Basically, if you know these things, you can use them to your advantage. Unfortunately, I had no idea of any of this when I came to Switzerland, and I still managed to get a position after a couple of months of applying. So when I say 2 years, this is generally what's expected of you in Switzerland, to apply early on so that you can confidently secure a position without having to stress about it last minute. So I did something that was pretty untraditional and it still worked out. So don't think that if you're considering moving to Switzerland and you're not 2 years early in advance that there's no chance for you. That is not the case. Number 4 is about progression. Now, back to the standardized UK system. So like you all know, it starts off with your foundation years 1 and 2. At that point, you decide if you want to go more into surgery or more into a medical job, go through your application process and start progressing. So let's say you're a CT1, so a core trainee 1, core trainee 2, and then you get into the specialty training, so ST1, ST2, ST3, and then you end up being a fellow, and then you're a consultant. I'm speeding up here, but basically every year you have a certain role with a certain title attached to it. If you're in a training program, you do have trust doctors and SHOs where they may keep the same title for a couple of years and it's not really clear what the progression is. But typically, if you're in a training program, you will have a clear title associated to you. So we know straight in when you join a team in a hospital what each person's grade and experience is. Now, that doesn't hold true to doctors who have not trained in the UK and have joined the team, because oftentimes they have much more experience. But in terms of the recognition of their degree in the UK, it puts them back a couple of years and they get a certain title with much more experience typically to their name. In Switzerland, again, it's pretty different. So here you go from being a medical student to an intern, what we call a médecin assistant or médecin interne. And that's basically what you're called until you finish your specialty training. So typically for internal medicine or for peds, it takes you 5 years. Well, generally, during those 5 years, you're called médecin assistant. There is no médecin assistant year 1, year 2, year 3, you're just médecin assistant, which means you could be fresh out of med school and be a médecin assistant, and you could have another one who's got 4 to 5 years experience, or maybe even 10, that happens, who is still a médecin assistant. And you can't distinguish between the two until you've worked with them and you realize that one has much more experience than the other. The next upgrade in terms of title is chef de clinique. You could say that's an equivalent between a high grade SHO and mini reg, depending on their level of experience. The earliest that you can become a chef de clinique is after 3 years of being a médecin assistant. And this is based on merit, experience, and where you're working. So for example, you've worked as a médecin assistant for 3 years, you're a very good médecin assistant, so let's say you're very good SHO level at that point, and you're working in a small peripheral hospital where they don't have enough chef de clinique. At that point, they may decide to give you the position of chef de clinique, so you're responsible for a group of médecins assistants. And basically all that means is you've got a different job description with different responsibilities and you're paid more. On the other hand, if you're in a big university hospital and you're an acceptable médecin assistant but you're not amazing, then you may just be médecin assistant until you finish your specialty training. Once you finish a set number of years you needed for your specialty and you've done all your exams and all your publications and you get your FMH of whatever specialty, at that point you are definitely a chef de clinique. You can't be a médecin assistant once you've finished all of that. So minimum it takes you 5 years. And I've already met some doctors who are in their 40s or 50s and are still médecin assistant. And that's for multiple reasons. One, they've come from abroad and they've never managed to get their years recognized, so their years from abroad recognized here. Second, they may never have gotten the positions they needed to complete the specialty of their choice. Let's say they may have gotten 2 years of peds and then the rest of the time they're in geriatrics waiting for another post in peds. And that means that they're médecin assistant for much longer than ideally they would have liked. And once you've gone past the médecin assistant phase and the chef de clinique phase, you can be médecin adjoint. Now, this is also a blurry one where essentially it's a role where you may have more research involved, you may have more teaching involved. You've definitely done your FMH, so that's clear. But doing your FMH is not enough to be médecin adjoint. So the equivalent of this is almost like a high reg level or fellow level in the UK. And there's typically 1 or 2 per department, depending on the size of the hospital. And then finally, there's the médecin cadre, who is the consultant boss head of the department. And they're the ones who are in charge. As you can see, there are a lot of exceptions and factors that will decide whether you're going to be a médecin assistant or chef de clinique, especially those two. And, you know, it can depend on the size of the hospital you're in. It can just depend on your level of experience, relationship with your bosses and how much they appreciate you. And it's not as simple as, oh, I'm an F1 because I've just started working, or I'm an SHO CT1 or CT2 with this much experience. And really, it makes it pretty confusing in terms of the progression. So the advantage with not having key titles specifying the number of experiences you have is that actually your progression is not just based on a mathematical standardized system, and it's not just your experience, it's also your merit, so the quality of your work. You know, some people progress faster than others. And here, really your work relationship with your colleagues, especially your seniors, the type of hospital you're working in, all those things can determine how fast you progress in your career, and will also affect other things like your finances because you get a high salary, etc. So that can be an advantage. This system works very well for some people. So for example, there's a doctor that I know here who completed her GP training in France and came to Switzerland. She wasn't able to get the number of years she did in France completely recognized in Switzerland. She's not very interested in progressing really far into her career. She's a mother of 3, she's very happy working part-time, so all she wanted to do is have a better quality of life in Switzerland, get better pay, and work part-time so that she could look after her kids. In that scenario, she's very happy staying médecin assistant for the rest of her career and not really having much career progression and not more responsibility, because in the UK, when you progress to CT1, CT2, ST1, ST2, that comes with responsibility as well. So I think it depends what you're looking for, and again, like the other points, it can be an advantage or a disadvantage. And finally, point number 5 is about quality of training and education. So in the UK, you have a set number of things that are given to you. So you've got bursaries and funding that you can access for conferences, for doing research, etc. You have study leave days that you can take to prepare for the exams that you have to do. And then you've got your weekly and monthly teaching sessions organized in the hospital. In Switzerland, it's not that different, but it is less standardized again. So you may be in a hospital, like a small peripheral hospital, where they do weekly teaching with a journal club session as well. So that's just a session that's led by one of the médecins assistants presenting a research article or a clinical case. Typically have 5 days allocated per year with funding, where you can organize essentially whatever you're interested in. So go to a conference or join a training course like ACLS or ATLS. It's up to you. In a bigger hospital, you again have those 5 days. You don't typically have study leave that's allocated to you for that year. You just have to take your annual leave. But you may have much more frequent teaching. So it could be daily teaching at lunchtime, plus something in the afternoon as well. And that's just because it's a bigger hospital, there's more resources, they're more organized, and that's pretty much it. So it really depends on which hospital you're in. But in connection to the 4th point, I want to talk about the concept of responsibility. And this is something I realized later on in Switzerland, because I felt like there was a difference in the progression, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And I think this is it. In the UK, as an F1, you look up to your F2. They're the next position that you're going to fill. They're the ones that know more than you, but not that much more that you can't relate to them. And the F2 is going to look at the CT1. The CT1 is going to look up at the CT2. And there's a clear stepwise approach to becoming the consultant or the head of the department. And that's what we talked about in the 4th point. But here I want to switch it around. So if you look at the other way, as an F2, you have an F1 that you're responsible for. You have an F1 that you try and teach as much as you can to. F1 has the medical students to look after. And there is this sense of responsibility that is given to you with each progression of your role. And I remember starting off as an F1, I felt like I knew nothing at all. I was terrified about the role that I was supposed to fill. And yet, as soon as I got onto the wards and got on to doing my job, the same job that I was doing as a medical student, all of a sudden, just because I was given that responsibility, I just owned it more. I did it because I had to do it. And so all of a sudden, instead of just doubting myself, I just got the job done. There was clearly a difference between the medical student version of me and the F1 version of me, even though we were doing the same thing, going on the ward round and taking notes. And I think this concept of responsibility is crucial in the progression of your training as a doctor. If you do not have this clear progression where there is somebody that you can look up to and learn from, and someone that you can teach in return as well, you don't progress as much. You're not going to progress as much because you're not developing the skills of teaching. Remember, you learn a lot as well when you're teaching somebody. You're learning to explain a concept simply. And also, if you don't know how to explain something to someone, you've not fully understood it. And if you can explain it, then you have understood it. The teaching is a great way and a really important way to further your training, and it's something that's incorporated in the UK system. In Switzerland, it depends on which hospital you're at. In bigger hospitals, there will definitely be medical students on your wards, so you're going to have that element of teaching and progression. But once you're in your next couple of years of médecin assistant, it gets a bit blurry. You're still teaching the medical students, and you know, in your team it's going to be clear who has more experience and less experience. So the médecin assistant who are just starting off, they're going to learn from the ones who are more experienced. But it's not an official distinction. You don't have the médecin assistant of 4th year and the médecin assistant of 1st year. And I just feel like the blurring out these roles is a bit of a shame because it makes your training and your career progression less clear. And to me personally, I think it's a very important factor in the quality of the training. There is an advantage to the Swiss system. So if you're somebody who's very proactive, you're a go-getter, you depend on yourself and not a standardized system to help you progress, then it's an advantage because there is no distinction between the médecin assistant 1st year and the 4th year one. You can be a 1st year médecin assistant and do really well, and after the 3rd year, you just move on to chef de clinique because you've just pushed yourself and you've done everything you needed to do to distinguish yourself. It takes a lot more effort and you have to be much more proactive to be able to move faster and progress faster. But it gives you that opportunity, the opportunity that you won't necessarily have in the UK. Because yes, the nice thing about the UK is that you've got a clear title of F1, and not all F1s are the same. You know, you may have an F1 who spent 6 years of medical school in a library and the other who spent 6 years mixing library plus clinical experience, and they're much more used to the job, and you can see that they're much more experienced at the same title that they have. So I think it would be unfair to say that the Swiss system of not having clear titles with numbers of experience clearly labelled is always going to be a disadvantage. There are definitely advantages. The reason why I can't say which system is better is because it depends entirely on your personality, what you're looking for in life, and what type of training program is more suited to you. And so if you think about these 5 points that we've talked about, the same point can be an advantage for someone and a disadvantage for somebody else. Up to you to decide which one it is in your case. So in summary, from my experience here in Switzerland, it takes more active effort to be able to progress and advance in your career. It takes more effort to apply to different posts and organize your pathway so that you're not losing years. And that's an added stress on top of your day job as a doctor, which is already hard work. There is the risk of being stuck for a couple of years, but it's not all bad. For everything that isn't standardized, you can end up on extreme levels of the spectrum. You can be stuck for a couple of years, it can be stressful, just as you can progress really quickly. You can use the system to your advantage to get the flexibility that you want, the opportunities that you deserve, and to finish your specialty training in a much shorter period, get paid much better for it, and live in the area of your choice. So really, it's up to you to decide. I'd love to know what you guys are actually thinking about these advantages and disadvantages and comparison between the two systems. So drop them in the comments down below. Don't hesitate to also just ask questions about the training system here and life generally in Switzerland. I hope you found this comparison useful, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!